Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Annie, very much for that very, very generous introduction. And thank you all for welcoming me here to your Congress. It feels remarkably familiar. I can't speak a word of Swedish, so I sat there listening to your votes just now, and I had no idea what was going on, which is exactly how I normally feel in our own party Congress when I was leader. And then a very nice lady here explained to me that you were voting about wolves. And we also vote about badgers and foxes. It's identical. And you no doubt will debate it next time as well. And you're also all looking forward, I understand, to the great party tomorrow night, which I'm told, it's rumored, witnesses people dancing on the tables before you've even eaten. We dance on the tables, but in a very British way. We only do it once we've eaten and drunken enough to have the courage to do so. And also, there is one difference. You meet every 2 years, and we meet twice every year, which, given all that dancing you do on the table, is probably just as well, because I think you'll be too exhausted if you did it as much as we did every year. Look, thank you very much. I want to pay tribute, if I may, on your behalf, and certainly on mine, and of all Liberals across Europe, to your leader, Annie. At the risk of embarrassing her, I think Annie is without a doubt one of the most dynamic, positive, and charismatic Liberal leaders in Europe today, and she carries the flame of liberalism exceptionally well. But also, I want to thank you, every single one of you, because, as Annie alluded to when describing the various isms we have to deal with these days, protectionism, socialism, populism, the politics of fear, the politics of division, the politics of prejudice, liberalism is always needed. It is a creed which is an old creed. It is an old philosophy of openness, of tolerance, of compassion, and of generosity. But boy, it is needed now more than ever before. And what I find so admirable about the way that you, as a party, and every single one of you in the party, you have been so outspoken in rejecting the politics of prejudice and fear. You have been by far the most outspoken opponents of the Sweden Democrats. Annie spoke yesterday so powerfully about the spectre, however small it might seem, but nonetheless the terrifying spectre of Nazism once again being espoused in parts of Europe. And you have been the fastest and the boldest and the loudest in condemning that trend towards the politics of fear and intolerance. And for that, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. But you haven't just talked about it, you've also walked the walk. Many of you I know, for instance, help Syrian refugee families, vulnerable Afghan children who are here on their own. And so you have shown through your actions, by welcoming people into your homes and into your communities, what open-hearted, generous-spirited liberalism really is. So please applaud yourselves for everything that you do. But you don't want me to spend the next 20 minutes or so that I'm with you just telling you how great you are. That'd be nice, but a bit boring. So if I may, I want to just say a few words about the wider challenges of liberalism in Europe today. And maybe I should start with what, certainly for my generation, I'm 50 years old, looking around the audience, I think I share that generational bracket with many of you. I think by far the most formative moment in my political life was in 1989 with the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And it's important to think back to those days, because prior to the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the politics that I grew up with in school and at college and at university was a politics which was very neatly polarized between right and left, between people who believed in high tax, low tax, the market, the state, the private sector, the public sector, the bosses, the workers. In the United Kingdom's case, either the Labour Party or the Conservative Party. And behind all of that was this ideological scaffolding which divided everybody into those two camps of the Cold War. And all of that dissolved suddenly, miraculously, beautifully, when the Berlin Wall fell. And I was a student in a university, a postgraduate student in the Midwest of the United States. And I remember my mother ringing me and saying, "You've got to turn the radio on, the radio on." We didn't have the internet then, didn't have a television. I was a student. And she was in floods of tears. And I also burst into tears, as I think millions of people did. Because I'd grown up until that point with this terrible fear, this terrible existential fear that our world was going to be changed out of all recognition, perhaps even eliminated because of this great standoff between Soviet communism and European and Western capitalism. And suddenly it went. And it was as if this sword of Damocles, this great threat, this great shadow which had hung over us, had suddenly disappeared like the morning mist. And that was a triumphant, wonderful moment. But I think it carried, with hindsight, great dangers for us liberals, because I think we became complacent. Francis Fukuyama, remember, he said, he's been a little bit unfairly misinterpreted, but he famously said, it marked the end of history. There were no more ideological conflicts. And I think we assumed, perhaps not overtly, perhaps it was more an unspoken assumption, that the basic values that we believe in of human rights, of democracy, of freedom, of a mixed market economy with a sensible and generous welfare state, that these truths, that these principles would simply endure effortlessly from that point onwards. How wrong we were. How wrong we were. Could anyone have imagined in 1989 that the politics we now inhabit isn't actually between the old-fashioned left and the old-fashioned right? Yes, we have our debates about taxation and a bit of privatization here or a bit of national control there. But actually now, in the 25, slightly more years, the quarter of a century since the collapse of the Berlin Wall, actually the great distinctions in politics are in many ways more visceral, angry, and fundamental between those who are comfortable with the pace of change and those who are uncomfortable with the pace of change. Those who embrace globalization, those who wish to protect themselves from it, those who are open to others coming into their community, and those who want to pull the drawbridge up. And then, of course, you had the catastrophic collapse in the global financial system in 2008. And that has introduced, or has exacerbated and exaggerated, a profound sense of economic and social insecurity amongst millions of our fellow citizens. You here in Sweden, you've suffered from your own financial crises in the past. The United Kingdom, as you know, was at the very forefront of that financial collapse in 2008 because of our oversized and overextended financial system. I remember being told in the early days when I became Deputy Prime Minister in 2010, I was told by an expressionless finance official from government, and he said, "Deputy Prime Minister, you do realize that the total of the toxic liabilities in the British banking system are equivalent to 5 times the size of the British economy." And the blood drained from my face as I realized that whether I liked it or not, all the great things I wanted to do in government, actually our principal job was simply making sure that financial bomb didn't blow up. It was, in a sense, we had to sort of defuse a bomb. But all of those events, the collapse of communism, the end of sort of deferential class-based politics, the much greater ideological fluidity, and then particularly the great shock of 2008, has left many, many of our fellow citizens more anxious, more insecure, more bewildered, more confused than ever before. I don't think actually Donald Trump would have been elected president if 2008 had not happened. I actually don't think the British people would have voted for Brexit if 2008 had not happened. It is impossible to exaggerate the significance of that grinding daily insecurity that many millions of our fellow citizens feel. It's difficult, you know, to be liberal when you're feeling frightened. And that's what we need to grapple with as Liberals. I remember very well on the Wednesday evening on the 22nd of June 2016, campaigning right up to the last minute in the referendum which took place the following day on Brexit, standing on a street corner handing out leaflets in the old-fashioned way in my then constituency in southwest Sheffield. Sheffield is a city, a great northern city in the north of England. And I met a man who I'd helped his family. His daughter had learning difficulties, and I'd helped as his local MP. I'd helped his daughter get into a school which could cater for her special needs. So I knew him. We liked each other a lot. He was a self-employed builder, big guy, great tattoos on his arms. And he crossed the street and cheerily said to me, "Hello, Nick." And I said, "Hello. How are you going to vote tomorrow?" He said, "Oh, I'm going to vote for Brexit." I said, "Oh, you don't want to do that." And then he said, by the way, "Oh, don't worry, you're going to win anyway." Expectations are very important in politics. But then he said something to me which I've never forgotten since. He said to me, "Oh, come on, Nick. You can't expect me to tick the box that says remain, as if everything is okay, as if all we need to do is just carry on as before." He said, "Since the banks blew up, it wasn't my fault. I'm taking less money home every week and every month to spend on my kids, to spend on my elderly parents. I'm working longer hours for the same pay, and this has gone on for 8 long years. And you are asking me now just to tick the box that says carry on as before? No, to hell with it. I want to blow the whole thing up. I'm so angry. Why is my family suffering when it was the bankers, the politicians, and the regulators who screwed up?" I had no answer. I had no answer for that. And millions of British people voted for Brexit for reasons that I disagree with, but which I totally understand. You cannot, in a mature democracy, expect millions of our fellow citizens to endure such long periods of time in which they feel there is no connection between how hard they work and the reward they get, and their sense of basic security and how they can look after their own family without witnessing a political backlash. And so my first suggestion to myself, to Liberal Democrats in the United Kingdom, but actually to Liberals everywhere, is that if we want to continue to grow, and you are growing so magnificently, doubling your opinion poll rating, if I understand it, since the last election, I can feel the confidence in this room. But if we want to grow even further, we must never ever lose our values and our principles, but we must also learn to reach out and have better answers than the populists for those basic insecurities that affect people's everyday lives. The second point I want to make is that if we underestimated as Liberals, and I think we did, after the collapse of the Cold War, the social and economic insecurities that many people experience, I think we also have, and maybe you have, but I certainly direct this at Liberals in the United Kingdom, maybe we were sometimes a little too insensitive to the great need that people have to have a sense of belonging, to have a sense of belonging, an identity in their own community, their own village, their own town, their own country. And that whether we like it or not as Liberals, that the very, very fraught and difficult debate about immigration is sometimes not actually to do with whether people exist or not from other countries or far-flung places in a particular community. It's a sort of fear that can take root in people's minds and in people's hearts, almost regardless of whether they experience immigration at first hand. And that poses a huge dilemma for us, because it means we're dealing with people who want to rediscover a sense of rootedness and belonging and identity, and are reacting to fears which might not even be real. Years ago, when I first stood as a candidate for the European Parliament, I was elected in 1999, and I think it was before I was elected, so it must have been 1998 or thereabouts. That's right, it was the early years of Tony Blair's government. I remember campaigning in a local election in a northern town in Derbyshire called Chesterfield, and I had you have green, we have yellow, my yellow rosette, And I remember going up to a chap who was leaning on the fence in his front garden. It was a nice spring day. And he just mowed the lawn. And he was obviously very proud of his house and his garden. And I went up to him and I said, "Hello, I'm Nick Clegg. I'm here for the Liberal Democrats, wondering whether you might support us in the local elections next Thursday." And he said, "Oh, no, I'm not going to do that." I said, "Oh, why?" "Oh, because of all of those asylum seekers." And at the time, this was back in 1997, 98, there was a huge controversy in the United Kingdom about asylum seekers that arrived in the ports in the southeast of the country. And I know that this is an issue in Sweden as well now in a completely different context. And then these asylum seekers were distributed around the country. And it was being very badly managed by the government at the time. And the tabloid right-wing newspapers were whipping public fear about all these asylum seekers around there, in your community. And I so happen to know as a fact that there wasn't a single asylum seeker in Chesterfield at the time. Not a single one. So I said to this man, I said, "Oh, right, the asylum seekers. Have you met any maybe in the supermarket or in the doctor's surgery or the post office?" And then he said something which again I've never forgotten ever since. And he said the following sentence. He said, "No, I haven't seen any of them, but I know they're everywhere." I thought, what am I supposed to do with that? How am I supposed to deal with that? But the point is, fear, however it is or is not linked to reality, is a very, very powerful emotion. And what I think we need to do as liberals is do exactly what you're doing, is standing up for openness, standing up for compassion, standing up for being generous-hearted and open-spirited, showing compassion to the vulnerable, welcoming those to this country who are fleeing tyranny and abuse and violence and suffering, but also at the same time show that we understand what it means to belong to a country as proud as Sweden or belong to a country as proud as the United Kingdom. We should never allow the populists, the xenophobes, those peddling prejudices to somehow claim they are more patriotic than us. There is nothing incompatible with patriotism and liberalism, open patriotism, tolerant patriotism. Pride in country and pride in community can be a liberal value as much as everybody else. And I know for sure that one of the reasons why the Brexit campaign in the referendum in the United Kingdom won was because it was cynical. It was based on lies and misinformation and exaggeration and half-truths. But one way or another, the Brexiteers, Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson and the rest, somehow managed to portray themselves as somehow more patriotic than those who wanted to stay in the European Union. I mean, it's a scandalous reversal of the truth. Because in pursuing their Brexit objectives, they will damage, deeply damage and injure the very country they claim to love. So my second point is we must never allow our opponents to monopolize patriotism. Let us make patriotism a liberal value which we espouse more proudly and forcefully than others. And my final point is about the European Union. You are blessed to live in a country where Swexit, is that right? Swexit, I understand, is not, at the moment at least, a particularly popular proposition. You are lucky enough to live in a country where the political elite is not obsessed by the European issue, as British politics has been disfigured for far too long. You are lucky enough to live in a country where, broadly speaking, whilst of course people will always have grumbles about the European Union is not perfect. I tell you, I lived and worked in Brussels for 10 years. It is a deeply imperfect organization. When I was first a European Commission official and then a European member of the European Parliament, I remember it took the European Union, I think I'm not exaggerating, close to 30 years to define chocolate in a chocolate directive. Any organization that takes decades to decide what the definition of chocolate is not a perfect organization. So of course it's imperfect. And by the way, one of the disputes was because the Brits were so adamant that our cheap and cheerful vegetable fat-based chocolate should be considered chocolate. And the haute chocolatier of Brussels and France were outraged by this Philistine ingredient. And this argument went on and on and on and on. Anyway, now that we're out, that will now be more easily solved, I guess. So, of course, it's not a perfect organization. But it is nonetheless an extraordinary entity which has helped to entrench peace in a continent which was consumed and enveloped by war and conflict and death on an unimaginable scale twice in the last century. It has created the world's most advanced, borderless marketplace in which ideas, money, people, goods, services circulate freely from one country to the other as if they were just moving from one Swedish town to the neighboring village. We have, not perfectly again, sought to act as the sum of our parts, exerting our collective commitment to some basic European liberal values of human rights, of democracy. I think, personally, the way in which the European Union embraced the countries of Central and Eastern Europe after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and after those countries escaped the tyranny of Soviet communism remains one of the most impressive acts of strategic intelligence that the modern world has seen, stabilizing the vast swathe of our continent in Central and Eastern Europe in ways which may very well not have happened if we'd not embraced them into the family of European nations. We are world leaders when it comes to environmental protection. And we are a union which has tried to entrench the idea of equal citizenship for hundreds of millions of men and women and girls and boys across our great patchwork continent. A continent which is so diverse, different religions, different histories, different languages, different cuisines, different chocolate. And yet somehow, miraculously, we have concocted out of that difference a sense of unity and cohesion, which would have been simply unimaginable a generation or two ago. I think that is an extraordinary, precious thing. And it's something that I feel not only as a politician, but I feel as a human being my mum is Dutch. She spent her formative years in a Japanese prisoner of war camp in Indonesia. My father is half Russian. My grandmother, on my father's side, fled Soviet communism and was part of that Russian diaspora that moved across Europe to find a new home. So my family, from both sides, is a family that intuitively, emotionally knows the value of the rule of law, of stability, of peace, of stable political institutions. These are very, very precious things. Very, very precious things. And I tell you, if you think they're precious, they feel even more precious when you feel them slipping from your grasp, as us pro-Europeans now do in the United Kingdom. But the final thought I want to leave with you is simply this. We should never take it for granted that everybody else understands the virtues of European integration. We should never be complacent that somehow what I take to be, or you take to be, the self-evident merits of European integration will speak for themselves. We have to remake the case over and over again. Okay, we're relieved, I think, as a continent, that Marine Le Pen did not win, Geert Wilders did not win, Podemos did not win. Nigel Farage thankfully spends more time in America now than the United Kingdom. Long may that continue. But we shouldn't imagine that populism has gone forever. Populism is now part of the political bloodstream in the European hemisphere, which we all share. And that is why our commitment, your commitment, Annie's commitment, the commitment of all other liberal leaders across Europe is so tremendously important. To not take what we have secured through painstaking hard work over the last 40 or 50 years for granted, but to remake the case for European peace, solidarity and reconciliation for the younger generations and future generations too. So, good luck. Thank you for inviting me. Keep debating wolves. Don't dance too hard. And I hope you do tremendously well in the elections next year. Thank you very much.